J. Warner Wallace is a homicide detective. He takes cold cases, and we know how tough that is. And you are now taking the case of Christianity in this riveting book, Cold Case Christianity, available at Crossroads eStore. You have to get this book. You absolutely have to get this book because it's written by a former atheist, three-generation police officer and his family. And Rick Warren led him to Christ, and then he took off like a rocket. He's pastored, and you're speaking all over. Now tell us, how did it happen?
Well, you know, I got interested because if you think about cold cases, they're events from the distant past. Usually we don't have any, really good eyewitness accounts. If we did, I mean, after all, they would be solved. They wouldn't be cold. And we don't usually have a lot of forensic evidence. So no living eyewitness is not a lot of forensic evidence. We put these cases together circumstantially. So if you look at how we are looking at the events of the distant past in the first century, an event in the distant past, no living eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence, but we can assemble the case circumstantially. So that's kind of been the view that I've tried to teach in this book. And it was a view that really helped me to come to faith. I spent many months and weeks digging through the Gospels because they seemed to me to have properties of eyewitness accounts that I saw in my criminal work. And it started me getting curious to see, who is this Jesus guy? And can I trust the Gospel accounts as reliable eyewitness accounts? And that's how I began.
I've been in Los Angeles, and I know a little bit about the crime in L.A. You're in Torrance,
yes.
And it doesn't get any tougher than Torrance.
Well, I think we are probably a pretty good city relatively, but you're right. We're surrounded by other communities that create some problems for us. We have a lot of commerce in our city, we have a lot of crime in our city in terms of when I was younger, we did bank robberies. I can't tell you how many bank robberies I worked. But in terms of cold cases, these are all just homicides because there's no statute of limitations on homicides. And so those cases, for the most part, stay open. They don't close. We have to find somebody, and sadly, some of these never get solved.
Now, you've taken the principles of a cold case and
yes.
solving it
yes.
to Christianity. What are the elements?
Well, what I tried to do is present 10 principles of how we examine evidence and some basic concepts. What is the power of circumstantial evidence? I can't tell you how many times I've heard objections, and I used to offer these myself. That would say, you don't have any good forensic evidence, you don't have any direct evidence in this case, therefore, I guess, we have no reason to believe what we believe. But of course, courts are constantly instructing jurors that circumstantial evidence is to be seen with the exact same level of integrity, of validity, as direct evidence. So I think if we can help people to understand the power, and I try to give some examples of how circumstantial cases are built, if you understand how they're built, you'll see the case for the Gospels, the case for the reliability of the Gospels is really quite strong. And then you're stuck with the resurrection. You're stuck with Jesus, who claimed to be God, worked miracles, and rose from the dead. And that's one of the things that became difficult for me as I'm reading through it and using all these principles to realize these are reliable accounts. Well, now what do I do with Jesus?
How did you go from atheist to Rick's sharing the gospel with you?
I stepped into that church just because I had a friend who had been inviting us forever. I mean, I was more than willing to go to church as an atheist with my wife, who was interested in more than I was, and I was more than willing to go with her, okay, as an atheist. And when I sat there, the first time really I'd ever been in a Protestant church or in a church that had musical worship, I mean, I'd never seen this kind of thing before. And I was watching it, and Rick was able to kind of interest me for the first time in the person of Jesus, just as a wise sage. I was no more interested in Jesus than you might be in Buddha or in Socrates or Plato or anybody from the distant past that's offering some proverbial wisdom. But as I sat through the Gospels to mine out the red letters, I saw properties that I recognized were similar to the properties I see in multiple eyewitness accounts of the same event. And as I saw those, I said, wow, this really requires me to take a second look.
Okay, you've got an atheist watching right now, Jim. Mm-hmm. You've got a successful, highly educated Canadian or American. You got 3 minutes to tell them about Christ, to consider Christ. Why? Look in that camera and tell them why.
Well, I think it comes down to this, really. It comes down to whether or not we believe the most important piece of evidence that's offered in the Gospels, and that is the resurrection. Do we have good reason to believe that the Christian explanation of the resurrection is actually the best inference from the evidence? So we have to kind of understand how we do this. It's a process called induction. But I would ask anyone to take a look at the minimal facts about the resurrection. What are the minimal pieces of evidence in the room? And then we look at what the possible explanations are for these pieces of evidence. And as we compare explanations to evidence, we can begin to kind of cross out those things that are least reasonable. Now, the thing that I think for me as an atheist was the least reasonable about the Christian explanation was that it requires that a resurrection is possible in the first place. It requires a view of the world, which is more than just a philosophically natural view of the world. It's a view of the world that accepts at least the possibility that miracles could occur. But if we're examining whether or not God exists, a supernatural being, we cannot begin from a worldview that denies the supernatural. At least let the evidence take you where it leads. Don't start off with a presupposition that will eliminate a particular conclusion. It's called circular reasoning. You end up where you started. And I've had a number of cases where, in fact, we did this very thing, and it took us a little longer to come to the truth because we were so determined that it ought to be in a certain box. So I would say to most people who are examining the resurrection, examining the life of Jesus, at least lay down your philosophically natural presuppositions, and that's where I was. And I would also say this, I suspect that there's sometimes more than just a rational reason why we would deny a truth claim. Sometimes we deny it for rational reasons, but sometimes we deny it for emotional or volitional reasons. So I really had to sit with myself and kind of dig through my own heart and see, am I really denying these because I've got rational objections, or am I denying these because Jim's comfortable being Jim's God in Jim's world? And that really, I think, was where I was. I was much more comfortable being the judge of what's right and wrong, the judge of what's virtuous and what's vile, and I was the judge of that. And that was a problem I had to eventually say, gosh, if there is a God, unfortunately, that means I'm not him. And it took me a while to get to a place where I was willing to not be God. And so that's, I think, what I would try to begin at least by laying down that presupposition.
So the elements of a homicide that's gone cold,
yes,
work in investigating Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, this is a circumstantial case. In the sense that we're going to take the eyewitness accounts and examine their reliability. So we have some direct evidence, eyewitness accounts, but of course we cannot cross-examine the eyewitnesses in court today. They're no longer available to us. So we have to find a way to examine their reliability. So I'm offering a template we use in court, which involves 4 major questions. Are they present? Is a witness present when they say they were actually there? Are they somehow corroborated in some other evidence? Are they accurate? Have they changed their story over time? And finally, are they biased? Those are the 4 criteria that we really kind of look at in large categories when we examine eyewitnesses in the courtroom. So I would suggest we take that same template and apply them to the authors of the Gospels and see if we can trust. Were they there early enough? Were they present? Have they, can they be corroborated by outside sources, archaeology, and internal evidences? Can they be determined to be accurate? Have they changed their story over the years? Is this a growing legend, or is this a reliable account? And finally, did they have a bias or a motive to lie to us? If we can look at those 4 areas and we don't find problems in those 4 areas, then I think we have to say, hey, be fair. You've got to consider them reliable until you find reason otherwise.
The book is called Cold Case Christianity. It's available on our e-store, and I think it's so essential for lay people to get this book because it helps segue you into the world of apologetics. This is a big word. A lot of people think we're apologizing for the gospel. No, we're proving the gospel.
That's right. That's right.
Apologia. We're giving the reasons for the defense. Now,
yeah.
A lot of apologetic books are reportial, okay? Mm-hmm. Tell me how this book's different than like Lee's Case for Christ or some of the others.
Yeah, and I love Lee. Lee wrote our foreword.
Sure.
He's a good friend, and I can tell you that I think I'm most likely probably as an investigator's heart looking at this, but what I'm trying to do in this book is to give you basic tools first. So I'm going to give you 10 principles that you need to kind of keep in mind. I don't care if you're examining this case or any cold case or what your kids were doing last night when they told you they came in 10 minutes late. Whatever it is you're examining in your life, you can use these 10 principles. And then we're going to apply those 10 principles to the Gospels and see how they measure up. So I'm hoping to do more than just give you facts. I'm hoping to help you learn how to think rather than just give you what to think. And I think you're right. Apologetics is not making an apology. It's not even making a defense as much as I'm making a case for. I'm not apologetic, and I'm not defensive. I actually have something I think I can substantiate with the evidence, and so I want to be able to make a good case.
Now, this is a command for Christians, and we take it
Absolutely.
from 1 Peter 3:15.
That's right.
Quote the verse and give us the impetus that Peter had behind writing the verse?
Well, I think it's so powerful because all of us feel a burden for evangelism as Christians. We feel a great commission on our heart, right? But if you look at what Paul says in Ephesians, he says some of you are evangelists, some of you are pastors, which means that some of us aren't naturally gifted in those areas. But Peter gives us no out. In 1 Peter 3:15, he tells everyone has to be able to give a reason for the hope that you have, right? And this is a commandment that's given to all of us. It doesn't say some of you are good at this and some of you aren't. This is a command. So I always look at myself and ask myself, am I living an abbreviated Christian life, or I'm just a Christian, or am I living the fullest, most robust life? As Peter describes, I'm a Christian case maker. And so what I'm hoping is to move toward all of us accepting what I call a second decision. We've decided to trust Christ for our salvation. Now we have to decide to make a case for what we believe to a world that really needs us to make a case. They're asking for us to make a case. Let's take that second decision and decide to be case makers.
You know, I did my doctorate at Acadia University, the Divinity College. My son and both we're fascinated by this. He just finished his PhD at Oxford.
I'm impressed. I'm so impressed.
So I'm going to give you 10 hard questions next time we meet.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to be the atheist.
Okay, fine.
Now, also, will you, just before we close, I want you again to tell our viewers why cold case Christianity is so important for them. I really believe in this book.
Yeah, I really believe that all of us are, we call ourselves one decision Christians. We've made a decision to trust Christ. We're saved, and that we've trusted Christ for our salvation. But I have a sense in the shrinking Christian environment in which we're living, in which the culture is becoming more and more secular, that now we're at a crossroads. I often have to say, hey, when you're on the way to an emergency, you pass by a lot of other misdemeanors on the way to the felony, a lot of other parking violations you don't stop and write tickets for, because, excuse me, I'm on my way to an emergency. And I think we are in that point in our culture right now. It's time for us to put aside the misdemeanors and the parking infractions because we've got to take care of business. And I think the business at hand is to make a case for what we believe.
Well, the book's called Cold Case Christianity. It's at our e-store.